Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking a look at GPU performance in Capcom's upcoming Resident Evil 3, which is set for a release on April 3rd, so in a few days' time from now. I won't waste any time explaining what the game's about or delve into the story. I'll just assume those of you who are interested in Resident Evil 3 GPU performance know all that stuff already. But what you might not know is today's video has a sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by PC Case Gear, Australia's premier online PC store. Whenever I'm in the need for a product, they're the first place I turn to, and I've been a customer of theirs for years now, so I really can attest to the quality of their service. I value their broad product range, competitive pricing, customer support, and easy to navigate website. With 2 decades of experience, I know I can trust PC Case Gear to look after you guys as well as they look after me. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so it's probably worth mentioning that the game is based on the RE engine, so that is the same game engine that's used by Resident Evil 7, Devil May Cry 5, and Resident Evil 2. Graphically, the game does look very similar to last year's Resident Evil 2, so I'm expecting pretty similar things in terms of performance. Now, on March 20th, a demo was released, which is really nice to see as it means gamers can get a really good idea of just how well their PC will tackle Resident Evil 3. So that means you won't need to look at the data here to try and guess where your PC lands. You can just download the demo and find out exactly how well it plays. The results here are more meant as an upgrade guide. So if you have a GTX 1060, for example, and you found the demo doesn't really play well enough, frame rates aren't quite where you'd like them to be for your targeted settings, then you can see how much more performance something like an RTX 2060 Super will offer you. And the targeted quality settings here are the maximum quality settings, or at least the max preset, and this has been tested at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. As for the benchmark pass, it takes place in a very early stage of the game, and having played Resident Evil 3 for about 2 hours now, this early section of the game seems very representative of what you can expect to find, at least in the first few hours of gameplay. And just lastly, all testing has taken place on our standard GPU test rig, which uses a Core i9 1900K clocked at 5GHz with 16GB of DDR4 3400 memory. Okay, let's jump into the results. Starting with the current generation of AMD and Nvidia GPUs, we see for over 60 FPS on average at 1080p, using the maximum quality settings, a GTX 1650 Super or 5500 XT 4GB will get the job done. And it's really only the base model GTX 1650 that struggles here, though the game was still playable. Then for those of you wanting to maintain over 60 FPS, you will require the 8GB 5500 XT or GTX 1660. Beyond that, we're pushing up towards 100 FPS on average, and $300-ish options such as the 5600 XT or RTX 2060 will be suitable for higher refresh rate monitors. Now, moving to 1440p, here we see the GTX 1650 unable to deliver playable performance, certainly not smooth playable performance, and probably not surprising for that particular part. It's not very powerful, and 1440p in most games will be too much for it. We also see that the GTX 1650 Super does dip well below 60 FPS, but it was able to deliver playable performance, probably not ideal at this resolution, and the same is also true of the 5500 XT. So for what I would call a much more ideal result, you will require something like the 1660 Super or 5600 XT. The RX 5700 and RTX 2060 Super were neck and neck, delivering 87 FPS on average, allowing them to match the RTX 2070. Likewise, the 5700 XT and 2070 Super are also very evenly matched, so in terms of cost per frame, this is a good result for AMD. Now, for those of you wanting to game at the 4K resolution, as expected, your options are much more limited, particularly if you want around 60 FPS on average. The RX 5700 will work, but 43 FPS on average is far from ideal, and the same really does apply to the 2060 Super, RTX 2070, and even the 5700 XT. So in my opinion, the 2070 Super is really as slow as I'd entertain going at the 4K resolution. And then while it is an absurd price to pay, the RTX 2080 Ti really is quite incredible, pumping out well over 60 FPS at all times for an average of 80 FPS. Okay, so we've seen how the current generation GPUs perform. Now let's take a look at the previous gen models. While technically not a previous gen part, the Radeon 7 is still included here as it's no longer current gen tech, and it's also been discontinued for some time now. Anyway, let's not get too bogged down in that one. I don't really want to argue whether it's current or previous gen or if it falls somewhere in the middle. Doesn't really matter. This is where we're sticking it. And we will compare all current and previous generation GPUs in a massive scrolling graph in a moment. For 1080p gaming, you'll want either a GTX 1060 or RX 570. Products such as the GTX 1050 Ti and RX 560 will require you to lower the visual quality settings at this resolution, while the vanilla GTX 1050 and RX 550 will likely also require you to drop the resolution. We see that the RX 580 and 590 offer amazing value here, keeping frame rates above 60 FPS at all times, so really quite an impressive result there. Also, the Vega models, they perform surprisingly well. Vega 56 edged out the 1070 Ti, while Vega 64 did the same to the GTX 1080. Then we see a big step forward with the Radeon 7, though sadly it couldn't quite get the GTX 1080 Ti, which has always been a bit of a disappointing reality for this 7nm GCN 5th gen part, despite arriving 2 years after the GTX 1080 Ti and coming in at the same price. It simply didn't offer anything new in terms of performance, at least for gamers. For those of you gaming at 1440p with a previous gen GPU, you'll ideally want at least an RX 580 or 590. Over the years, I have recommended the RX 580 over the GTX 1060 as a better long-term investment, and we're certainly starting to see that prediction come to fruition, as here the Radeon GPU was almost 20% faster. Again, the Vega GPUs managed to match or just outpace their Pascal rivals, so a decent result there, but also not really anything for Vega fans to celebrate too loudly. As for 4K gaming on previous gen hardware, the GTX 1080 Ti and Radeon 7 deliver really what is a great experience, but beyond that though, it starts to feel like sort of current generation console gaming. It's a bit too 30 FPS-ish. Okay, so here we have the 1080p results for all 34 GPUs tested. I won't go over all the data again, and for easier viewing, these graphs will be available to our Patreon members. But of course, anyone can just pause the video and compare the current and previous generation GPUs. It's clear that the Radeon GPUs do perform well in this title relative to the Nvidia competition. Nothing extreme here, just solid performance across the board. Some noteworthy matchups at 1440p can be seen when comparing the RX 570 and GTX 1650 Super, the RX 590 and 1660 Super, and then right at the top of the graph, we have the Radeon 7 beating the GeForce RTX 2080 by an impressive 11% margin. Certainly not a massive performance difference, but it is a very solid result for the Vega 20 GPU. And here we have the 4K graph, which clearly illustrates why 4K gaming is yet to take off. And that's because the vast majority of the 34 GPUs tested are just unable to deliver playable performance, or at the very least, smooth performance. And turning down visual quality settings just to increase the resolution from say 1440p to 4K, it doesn't actually improve image quality overall. So again, this is why 4K is yet to gain any real traction with gamers. And here's a quick look at preset scaling, and unlike Doom Eternal, which we recently looked at, the presets actually provide meaningful changes in performance and also visual quality. Whereas we saw about a 20% increase in performance with Doom when going from the maximum quality preset to the minimum quality preset, here we see a much healthier 70% uptick in performance with Resident Evil 3. Scaling for both AMD and Nvidia GPUs is virtually identical, so this means we see about a 7% boost when going from the max to graphics priority preset, then a further 15% increase when dropping down to the balanced preset, and then about a 40% increase when dropping right down to the lowest quality preset, performance priority. So the game should be playable with the lowest quality settings on very old hardware, and of course that's always great to see. Okay, so Resident Evil 3 plays very well on current and previous generation hardware using the maximum quality preset, and although I have tested the pre-release version of the game, I don't expect the results to change in a meaningful way with the full version, which is due out in a few days' time. I'm also confident of this because the margins are virtually identical to what we found previously when testing with Resident Evil 2. In fact, the Resident Evil 2 results never really changed that much after our initial look at the game, which is reasonable given how well the game is optimized. Looking back at the now year-old Resident Evil 2 results, we find some surprisingly similar numbers. For example, at 1440p, the RTX 2080 Ti averaged 149 FPS, and in today's test, it averaged 150 FPS. The GTX 1070, as another example, it averaged 65 FPS in our original Resident Evil 2 testing, and today it averaged 67 FPS in Resident Evil 3. The AMD Radeon results are also very similar. Previously, Vega 56 averaged 85 FPS, today's test saw it average 78 FPS. And then as a final Radeon example, the RX 570 averaged 42 FPS in the previous test, whereas in today's test, it averaged 45 FPS. So moving forward, I don't expect future AMD or Nvidia drivers to have much of an impact on performance in this title. But as I said, that's not really a bad thing, and in many ways it can be viewed as a positive. Right out of the gate, you're receiving maximum performance, and this means past generation products such as the GTX 1060 and RX 580 have no trouble delivering smooth, playable performance at 1080p with the game maxed out, and I have to say, it does look very good. On that note, for those of you wanting to enjoy Resident Evil 3 in all of its glory with smooth frame rates, having at least 6GB of VRAM is ideal. The 4GB 5500 XT didn't perform quite as well as the 8GB model, and the only difference here is VRAM capacity. The game is quite heavy on VRAM allocation, actual usage is harder to gauge, but with the game allocating over 7GB at 1080p, maintaining smooth performance with a 4GB buffer won't always be possible. In fact, performance with the 1650 Super, 4GB 5500 XT and other 4GB GPUs would have been a lot worse had I not been testing with a high-end Core i9 9900K test system with 16GB of DDR4 3400 memory. This is because while the 8GB 5500 XT only saw system memory or RAM allocation peaking at just over 7GB, the 4GB model saw allocation reach 9.5GB. Had there not been enough system memory, so say you only had 8GB of DDR4 memory, which is plausible when you're using these lower end graphics cards, that would have meant the 1% low performance would have surely suffered with the GPUs packing 4GB or less VRAM. As for CPU performance, Resident Evil 3 is really no different to what we've already seen with Resident Evil 2, so that is to say a decent quad-core processor with SMT support will work just fine, peaking at around 70% utilization. The game also load balances across cores very well, and a 6-core 12-thread processor will see load spread across all cores very evenly, though again the game isn't terribly CPU demanding, so a Ryzen 5 3600 for example only see total usage hit around 50%. When comparing the Ryzen 5 3600 or really any Zen 2 based processor to the Core i9 9900K, you're going to see virtually identical frame rates using an RTX 2080 Ti at 1080p, so exactly what we've seen previously when testing with Resident Evil 2. And that brings us to the end of my Resident Evil 3 GPU benchmark, but you'll see more Resident Evil 3 results in upcoming reviews and content as I'll be adding this title to the huge range of games we already actively test with. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to do those YouTube things. There's the like button, subscribe button if for some reason you haven't already done that. We also have merch if you're interested in that, and of course our Patreon account where you can access our exclusive Patreon Discord server, monthly live streams with Tim and myself, and a few other cool perks. Above all else, thank you for watching. I'm your host Steve, and I'll see you again next time.